Welcome to UNSW's Engineering the Future podcast, a series where we'll speak to academics and industry leaders who are embracing cutting-edge ideas and pushing the boundaries of what is truly possible. In this episode, we'll shine a light on the exciting developments in the solar technology industry and discuss what impacts we can expect on society as a whole over the next 2 decades. We'll hear from leading experts in the field, Professor Renate Egan and Dr. Zi Ouyang, as they share the roadmap to how Australia will achieve 100% of its energy from renewables, with half of that from solar technology. They'll also reveal the innovative ways the industry is using to capture, buy and sell solar energy, and how researchers are collaborating with industry leaders to improve the efficiency of existing and new solar cell technology. So join us as we discover how world-changing action starts with fearless thinking in engineering the future of solar.
Hello, and welcome to Engineering the Future of Solar. My name is Neil Martin, and I'm a journalist and STEM communicator working in the Faculty of Engineering at UNSW. Joining me today to discuss what changes we can expect in the development of solar power over the next 30 years is UNSW Professor Renate Egan, Executive Director at the Australian Centre for Advanced Photovoltaics. Renate spent 2 decades in the PV industry, where she led manufacturing and technological development, and her research now includes assessing new technologies for their commercial viability and impact on energy markets. As an innovator, entrepreneur and academic, Renate is passionate about using her skills to increase the uptake of solar and accelerate the energy transition. Hi, Renate.
Hi, Neil. Thanks, and it's terrific to be here.
It's a pleasure. Also with us is Dr. Ouyang, Vice President and Chief Technology Officer of JA Solar, a world-leading solar module manufacturer. Ouyang is a researcher, manager and entrepreneur with 20 years' experience in clean energy research and technology commercialization. His goal is to help develop green energy technologies that can make the world a better place to live. Welcome, Ouyang.
Hi, Neil.
44 quadrillion watts of power. That's the amount of energy hitting the Earth each year from the sun, according to NASA. Or to put it another way, the equivalent output of more than 40 million large electric power plants. Luckily for the global population, that source of solar power won't run out for billions of years. We're not looking that far into the future on today's episode, but just as far as 2050, when the major goal is to reach net zero greenhouse gas emissions in order to avert the worst impacts of climate change. Solar energy obviously has a huge potential role to play in that, but currently only around 14% of energy produced in Australia comes from photovoltaics. Renate, starting with a very direct question to you, what percentage of energy produced in Australia do you think will be from solar if we look ahead to 2050?
To 2050. So by 2030, it's already ahead of the numbers. The 2023 numbers have just come in and we're much closer now to 20% of our electricity being met by solar for the year of 2023. By 2030, the targets are to be at over 80% renewables, and we would expect 40% of that to come from solar. By 2050, we will be looking at 100% renewables, and we would expect over 50% of that to come from solar. 50 to 60% of the electricity needs will be met by solar. And our electricity needs are going to grow because we need to electrify everything. So all of our thermal processes where we rely on gas and all our transport processes where we rely on fuel will be switching to electric.
You must be very enthusiastic about those potential numbers and the growth in solar. Does it surprise you in some way?
The industry keeps surprising me because it's growing at a phenomenal rate. The last 20 years has been really exciting, and I think the next 20 years are going to surprise everybody. And in fact, how quickly it's growing is really important to communicate because we're all going to see that change in the next 20 years. We will see the reduction in the use of gas, reduction in the use of fossil fuels, coal burning, and we need to get used to that and to understand as a community what impacts that's going to have on our lives.
Ouyang, that was the stats They're really up-to-date stats. Thank you, Renate, for updating my numbers. Those were the stats for Australia. Do you see the same potential growth in numbers for the global industry?
Yeah, I think relatively at the same pace, but I think actually Australia is ahead. So the penetration of green and renewable energy is actually ahead of the rest of the world. If not the best, then it's one of the best. So we are actually technologically experiencing something that the rest of the world hasn't been seeing. So that's great. That's why we have our leading research here in the university and the institutes, because we are the first country actually experience a lot of chances as well as challenges.
And is the reason for that the fact that Australia has lots of nice sunshine and maybe quite a lot of space to put solar panels?
Yeah, I think so.
And I think Australians get the sun. So we have more solar on rooftops in Australia than anywhere else in the world. And we have more solar per capita than anywhere else in the world. Netherlands is coming close. They might just beat us because we've had a bit of a slow year in 2023 for new installs. So we may well no longer be the leading per capita. So we need to pick up our game so we can get in the number one position again.
It's good to have some competition, and I think Australia love a competition and trying to be number one. So that might be a great incentive. Obviously, the way you say it there, it sounds like it might be slightly easier for Australia, but I guess then it makes challenges for other countries to do that if they don't have the same amount of sun, if they don't have the same amount of space. How do you think that pans out for countries that have that big challenge?
Well, you have to be green in some way. If it is not that you generate, like, for example, solar in your territory, then you have to use the solar to transform the energy and use that secondly. Then there's not necessarily the energy, solar energy, for example, where it is generated will be the place where it is going to be used. So it's actually that's why we want to say that the globalization, even for renewable energy, is very critical. You can't just look into individual countries. You really have to look at globally.
And it's important to note that there's a really good balance typically between solar and wind. Even Australia, we'd probably be looking at a close to 50% split between solar and wind. We are blessed with a lot of land that can take the solar, but we also have great wind resources. And most of the countries around the world will have a balance of solar and wind. And interestingly, a lot of the offshore wind, we hear about that a lot. It's happening in and around Europe. Offshore wind is really quite prevalent. And it's starting to happen in and around Asia, but they can also do floating solar, particularly around the equator where the sea is quite flat and still.
Going back to the numbers that you mentioned in terms of the growth, especially in Australia, how do you perceive that growth to be achieved? Is it just a case of putting more solar panels in more places, or does that come from solar panels being more efficient? What kind of drives that growth?
Both. So we've seen in the last 20 years, we've seen the average efficiency from the modules being produced double. So from 10, 11, 12%, now module efficiencies are up at 24%. So you're getting twice as much power out of the same space. And the technology limit for silicon we're going to see those module efficiencies go probably to 25%, maybe 26%. And then, so the research that we're doing is looking at pushing that beyond 25, 26% to more like 30%. So there's a research element that will see higher efficiencies. The price continues to drop phenomenally.
And what's driving that price drop?
Economies of scale, largely, and increased automation.
Yeah, it is just two factors. One is efficiency, not any more efficient solar panels, but the more efficient equipment used and the resources like a keep reduction of the silver usage per cell or per watt. And also it's a scale of manufacturing that make things just cheaper.
But you also said, Renate, I think that there will be more solar panels in more places, which obviously the more you put up, the more power you get out.
Yeah, that's right. So Australia leads the world in rooftop solar, and as a result, we have some of the cheapest rooftop installs. Because we've been doing it for so long and because we've streamlined all the processes, the cost of putting solar in the roof in the US is at least 2 to 3 times more expensive than in Australia. It's phenomenal because of regulatory overheads and market dynamics. They've actually not been able to drive the price down nearly as much as we have here by doing. We've been learning by doing. What we have done, we've also done studies around the commercial and industrial rooftops, around how much solar we can put on commercial and industrial rooftops, and there's space for 3 times as much solar as we currently have installed on commercial and industrial rooftops. If you ever look at Google Maps or if you fly into a city, look at all those rooftops. It's phenomenal real estate and it's producing energy where it's needed, which is why we should be having more on commercial and industrial rooftops.
Ouyang, do you see the same kind of developments abroad? Maybe with regards to that kind of rooftop solar, but I've been looking in some research and say, for example, China seem to be doing a lot of big solar panel arrays in the desert, for example. How do you see global developments happening to kind of boost those numbers?
Globally, I think if you can't remember the number, then it's 50-50. That's a good starting point. It's really about, we call it distributed system, where the usage is where the power is generated. And also we have centralized or ground-based big solar plants where you need to use the transmission line to pump the energy to big cities or something like that. And if we look at the market, you will find interesting, very interesting. We talk about 2030, 2050 target, right? And you put up the line is roughly 25% growth each year. On average, you find that number actually pretty accurate. But each year, it's always fluctuating. But if you dig it a bit further, you will find, take Australia, for example, when you have a big year for solar, and then the number will go small because you find the grid cannot take that much more.
Right.
Then you will have good business in terms of a transmission line upgrade and battery storage. So what I'm saying is whenever you have a small year for solar, you have a big year for battery. And once the grid can take more, and you find the battery market is not that great anymore and the solar is picking up. So it's always balanced. You find it interesting. The market is always balanced in a phase that matched very well.
And it maybe proves that all of these things are interlocked and dependent on each other. You mentioned batteries there, and that's interesting, I think, because I guess the kind of basic criticism that sometimes gets thrown is, oh, well, it's not always sunny, and what are we going to do if it's a cloudy day? I guess the battery technology does come into that in terms of the development and the storage. That, I guess, needs to keep progressing as much as the solar panels and the efficiencies that you were talking about.
Yeah, that's right, Neil. And it is. It's phenomenal, and it's actually assisted by the growth in electric vehicles, because the huge market for electric vehicles is driving technology development in batteries generally. We actually have all the technologies we need to deliver this energy transition. What we need is to develop them, to drive the prices down, and to get the integration right. So making sure we've got enough of everything installed when we need it as coal-fired plants come offline, and to make sure that's integrated. And again, that the consumer understands. And we need to send messages to the consumer about when the price of energy is lowest and when it's highest. You'll recall that we've had hot water system off-peak electricity for a long time because energy demand overnight was low. So people were incentivized to heat their water overnight.
And
that's
some
going to
people get
shift.
obsessed by that.
Yes. Well, and so I can tell you also get obsessed by your battery when you've got one at home too, your energy consumption and use. That's going to shift because it's the cost of energy in the middle of the day is going to be effectively zero, because we are already seeing in the middle of summer now overcapacity. We have more energy than we need in the middle of the day. So what we need to do is incentivize people to start to use that, whether it's to charge your car, charge your house battery, or to heat your hot water. Industry are also driven by it too, because obviously the cost of energy is important to industrial processes, and they're seeing now how cost-effective solar and wind are and moving their processes. There are lots of big industries who are actually building their own solar plant on their own land behind the meter so that they can access this really low cost of energy.
Which potentially drives the cost down of lots of things.
Yes.
Which will be benefit to everyone, especially in the current cost of living crisis. I'm sure people will be keen to hear that. You mentioned there about these being engineering challenges, but I believe there are technological developments that are happening in solar powered technologies and developments. I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about some of those that might be new. People might not have heard of them at the moment. I guess they might have knowledge of silicon-based solar panels, but maybe those won't be so common in the future. What are some of the new things that might be coming online in the next sort of 10 to 20 years?
Yeah, we're actually at really quite an exciting stage. So UNSW, you may be aware, held the record for the silicon solar cell efficiencies for some 30 years at around just over 25% efficient was the solar cells and we held that record until 2010 or thereabouts. And there are now manufacturers producing solar cells at that as an average efficiency. Because the manufacturing is happening at such a significant scale, millions and millions of solar cells are being produced every day. So they're actually able to refine the processes well beyond what you can do in a lab. So they're actually achieving average efficiencies at the level that we were setting as records.
It used to be the world record,
yes.
Yeah.
So absolutely phenomenal
It's the equivalent
change.
of every normal person running 9.5 seconds for
Yes.
100 metres like Usain Bolt.
That's right. So just because we all got, busy and tried to improve our fitness. So even the manufacturers are looking at the ceiling that they are facing with the technology and saying, what's next? And the universities are driving the research into the what next of solar cells. So the way to think of it is that the solar cell is kind of like a single battery, and the way it works is it absorbs some of the sun's light and miraculously, with just the material, the silicon material, can turn that sunlight into electricity. There are gaps in that sunlight that silicon can't access. So we want to add another cell on top that will absorb the light that the silicon's missing. So we call that a tandem structure, two cells, one on top of the other. And we're working on the materials. There's innovation and discovery going on the material that would be ideal for that tandem structure. It has to take the rest of the light that silicon is missing, but not take too much of the light that silicon is really good at absorbing. So now we're looking at how to stack that on top of silicon. And we're also mindful, because silicon is an amazing material. It's so stable. So we can put the silicon solar cells out in the field. The panels now have a lifetime guarantee of 30 plus years that they'll sit out there in the field and produce as much as 90%. So the material that goes on top has to be as stable. So we're working on improving the stability of these materials as well and fitting the cells together to make the tandem. It's fun stuff.
Ouyang, you must be excited about that kind of development as well. Do you see that being the big new thing for solar panels, or is there something else that might be in development?
Yes, no. I agree with Renate. Tandem will be the future, almost 100%. Maybe I should say 99.9%. But what's been put on top, that's still a question in my mind. So in my group, we work on perovskite. Like a company like J Solar, tier 1 company, we not necessarily will produce all the solar panels in different ways at the gigawatt scale, but we definitely have in our R&D team tried everything there. I ask my colleagues, please look into other materials, because we still have problems to be solved for perovskite, and not necessarily we will have the solution at the right time. I always emphasize at the right time, because we're talking about 25% growth each year. And my company produced this year, I think, close to 100 gigawatt solar panels. If any technology, no matter it's the manufacturability or the market or stabilization issue, like Renate said, cannot fulfill such a large scale, then it's a big question mark for that.
Yeah, and I guess there's always a gap between what's happening on the R&D or in the academic sphere and like you said, what actually needs to be done on a commercial scale. Are there some numbers I know sometimes people have theories about how efficient certain things can be, and they know that they can get to that number. Is that the case with these tandem cells, that you think you can get to maybe 50% or whatever number it might be?
So we've already demonstrated efficiencies over 40% for a tandem cell technology, but it's not a manufacturable process. We've demonstrated efficiencies over 30% of a tandem cell technology, which is closer to a manufacturing process. And we think we can both push that efficiency up and actually demonstrate it's manufacturable. So that's up from module efficiency or efficiencies now of 25%. So we're seeing that is the kind of boost that industry is interested in. So 30% is where our targets are, and our targets are 30% by 2030. So we're really pushing to get a manufacturable cell process ready by 2030. And I'm sure that the industry is chasing that as well.
Renate, I had one magic number to help you, to help the audience
Please
to understand.
Yes.
If you have to remember one number, that is for every 1% absolute efficiency improve, you cut the cost down by roughly 6%. That magic number, it was there like 10 years ago and still valid today. So that's the main driver. So when we say high efficiency, low cost, reliability, they all actually the triangle interlink to each other.
When I was researching this episode, looking at future solar technologies, one thing that cropped up that I thought was quite interesting was people were talking about the potential for developing solar paint, which seemed to be a paint that you put on your wall, and it has photovoltaic properties that would then, create power. Is that going to be happening in the future, do you think?
So my perspective on the concept of solar paint is one that helps people understand that solar will be everywhere, right? So that we can cover all surfaces with solar. The idea that we can paint it on at home and that will generate power is very future thinking, blue sky thinking, inspirational, if you like. But the reality is we are actually producing now in Australia at the CSIRO in Melbourne and a group in the University of Newcastle, a thin film roll-to-roll printing process, a bit like the way our old banknotes or current banknotes are still printed, and the way chip packets are printed. On a flexible polymer backing, you can print materials that you can turn into solar cells. So that's possible. And you can imagine hanging solar canopies, flexible solar arrays in various surfaces. The performance is a little lower than the ones that are fit for rooftop solar panels and the field solar panels. But the concept of solar paint, I think, translates to these thin film sort of flexible panels which can go on every surface. Ouyang?
Yeah, I agree. Yeah. It's not something that you go and paint a house. You need to have the professional to do it.
And I guess the point you made there is quite important, that these things do need to be efficient and they do need to be giving you a decent output of power to make them worthwhile. And maybe they're not there yet, but, I guess development is going on apace with those as well.
Yes, it's certainly being developed, driving down the cost. There are efficiency limits to those technologies that will mean that they probably will never, some of the organic photovoltaics, which is the OPVs or organic photovoltaics, are pushing 20% now in the laboratories. But I still think that means that the flexible films are going to be probably 10 to 15% efficient.
One of the other things that came up was regarding solar windows, which I guess kind of makes sense because, again, you talk about solar power everywhere. We have windows everywhere. So it seems to make sense to me that you just make a window that also creates power.
It is kind of contradicting because in order to make the solar cell more efficient, it needs to absorb more light. But on the other hand, the window needs to be transparent in order to see through. So it's kind of not the same way. But fortunately, what we see through our eyes is not necessarily all the energy in a spectrum that can be used by the solar cell. So some smart engineering can play that role that makes sure some of the spectrum can be used for the solar cells to generate electricity without affecting the stuff you can see through the window. So yes, there's definitely a potential for solar window, but we shouldn't expect it to be as efficient as the standard solar modules.
There are also some interesting designs being developed where the solar absorbing materials are not in the glass of the window, but they're in the frame of the window. So it is still effectively a solar window, but it's not what you might conceive of straight away. It's the frame or the structures of the frame that are used to generate the energy.
This episode's called Engineering the Future. Very futuristic thing I read, Ouyang. I don't know if you're aware that apparently recently they put a receiver in space to pick up solar power from space and beam it back to Earth. It seems very futuristic to me. Do you perceive that to be something that might be happening in 2050?
Absolutely. There will be a niche market for that, but I say niche market, yeah. So like in rural area, remote area where wiring is an issue and you can't have a better way to get the power from the grid, or you don't even have a standalone system, then probably you can use that. Actually, I heard this idea like 5 years ago from Google, if I remember right. They funded one of the very futuristic ideas from their startup program or whatever. I see at this stage, the energy loss is an issue, and also the direction is an issue, because imagine you have a satellite, you have to say the target where you want to transfer the energy on Earth, where you have to really zoom in and very focused, almost like a laser technology to be very accurate. I see there's some very big engineering challenges, but now since you say 2050, why not? Yeah, anything can happen there.
Blue sky thinking or dark space thinking, as it might be. Sounds like quite an expensive process, though.
Yeah, I put my cost-effective lens onto this and say that there will almost certainly be a more cost-effective solution to delivery of energy. I cannot conceive of energy coming from outer space as being, sending the solar panel payload up there, getting the engineering right. I think it's all possible. I just don't think it's cost effective. And I think the problem they're trying to solve by putting solar in space is the sun goes down problem. The sun going down and coming up the next morning doesn't surprise us. We've been doing it for years. So we have been thinking about how to manage that. And there are ways. There's battery storage, obviously. There's pumped hydro storage, which is the greatest use of storage around the world today, is pumped hydro, and very reliable once you get it built. Then there's east-west wiring or east-west cabling. We're able to communicate through cabling. We'll be able to share energy through cabling.
And I think this is already happening to a certain degree, I think. I think Sun Cable was a potential and seems to have had some problems, shall we say, but maybe from an engineering perspective, it's not a problem. And also in China, I think they building big solar panel arrays in the Gobi Desert and other deserts and transferring that to big cities.
Yeah, they use ultra high voltage transmission line. When you have very high voltage, then for the same power, the current is low, and therefore your energy loss in a green line is significantly reduced by orders. So you have to have the right infrastructure to make it happen. When you have that, yes, it's possible.
And China is doing it. And that is the Sun Cable vision. And the Sun Cable vision was a sunshot initiative, if you like, compare it to a moonshot initiative, to imagine a future where this is happening and to start to dream it. And I still think with that project, even if they get half the way there in twice the time, they will have achieved something that was not conceived of as possible. And that's worth doing. It's what we need to be doing, is to be trying to achieve things that haven't been. And then again, it's engineering challenges, right? It's not that it's physically impossible. It's an engineering challenge.
And that seemed to run into some political or economic problems that I think are a bit too complicated for this episode.
It's a question of, if we have all this opportunity around solar in Australia, do we export, and we can see a declining coal and gas market? How do we replace our economy with clean energy exports? And there are two ways to do that we're forecasting, and one of them is through what we call a hydrogen economy, where we're producing hydrogen and its derivatives, notably ammonia, for export, which we can then ship around the world. Alternatively, we cable the energy out of Australia. So those are the two pathways. And basically, my understanding of what happened is that the investors decided to lean on the hydrogen pathway less than the cabling pathway, which is why they've hit a hurdle. But I do believe they're recovering, and they're going to continue with the cabling concept as well.
Sounds good.
And they all use solar anyway.
Yes. Yeah, at the heart of it, all of this clean energy revolution and energy transition, our energy exports, the possibility that we can do further minerals processing in Australia because we'll have this vast amount of green energy is on the back of having plenty of solar energy and wind.
Actually, Neil, when you asked the first question, why Australia is ahead, my thinking, which is maybe debatable, was that we have such a big mining industry, coal industry over there. So when you have to transform, you really have to find a way out. That's why I push the renewable energy moving very fast. It's somehow, not so intuitive, but I think that the big chunk of coal industry that actually play a role in our renewable energy development.
You bring up the issue of mining there, and that's a good segue into something that I wanted to talk about with regards to the fact that there are scarce resources required for this growth in renewables and especially in solar panels. I guess there are also problems with that massive increase in growth that you were talking about, Ouyang, in terms of getting those scarce resources and the pressure that might put on sustainability.
Well, actually, again, it's also cost effective. I mean, it's not only about Australia. Globally, all the big energy companies, mining companies, they're all turning into renewable, not only about the ESG issue, but it's also a revenue generator as well.
And I'm happy to talk to you about the critical minerals and resources, because the silicon solar panels that we have today have the only element in there that the industry sees as a challenge is silver.
Right, yeah.
Right? We currently use around 15 to 20% of the world's silver, and we need to double and then double again the amount of solar we install. So clearly we can't do that with silver because we're going to be using too much silver. But the industry responds to that. But we know that this is a challenge, so we're working on alternatives. There's an Australian company called SunDrive who's looking at a silver-free processing, and there are other companies who are also looking for alternatives to silver to develop the technology without silver. So we will solve the silver problem, and that is really, in the silicon technologies today, the only element that is a challenge. Yeah. Silicon is just about the most abundant, comes from sand, plenty of sand out there. The other thing, of course, is that these things have long lifetimes, unlike a fossil fuel, which you dig it out of the ground and you use it once and it's gone. These solar panels and batteries batteries typically have a 10-year warranted lifetime. Same story. 90% of their performance after 10 years. It's not that 10 years you throw them away. It's that their performance is not, as it was the day they bought it. The same with silicon panels. 30 years, they will be performing at 90% of the output power the day they were bought. So these things have really long lifetimes, and even at the end of their life, we can recycle them. So battery recycling is a really big industry because of the value of the elements in the battery. The elements in the solar panel, other than silver, don't have a lot of value. So there's not a lot of industry yet around solar panel recycling in a circular economy sense, where you take the panel and put it back into the solar supply chain.
Yeah, just give you another number. So when we say we meet the target, right? So then with the 25, 30 years of lifetime, you probably still, when the industry sort of stop growing, you still have to replace, I think, 3, maybe to 5 terawatts of solar panels each year. So that's probably the scale of recycling industry.
Mm-hmm. At which point it will be cost effective.
Yep.
But I guess we're maybe starting to see a bigger and bigger growth in that solar panel recycling, because those, maybe I'm right, the first generation that were kind of taken up by especially the Australian public are now coming to the end of that kind of, I think, 15 to 20 years. So is there a big spike at the moment of maybe solar panels that do need to be recycled?
We've just done a study on that, looking at the panels where they're deployed, where Australia has some really good data on the back of the incentives that the government put in place around installation of solar panels. As a result, we know where they all are. So we've been doing some analysis about when they come out off the field. But the volumes still are small currently. And is there a spike? The spike will happen when the first large-scale solar farms come offline.
Right.
And then it's an industry challenge or an opportunity, if you like, and they're aware of it.
And I'm guessing this is happening across the globe, Ouyang. It's not just an Australian issue with regards to solar panels now being needed to be recycled properly and in a kind of sustainable way.
Yeah, and one of the biggest issue is the logistics. So it's heavy, it's better to be treated locally on site, which is interesting. We see some alignment between the kind of waste management companies. They are mostly interested in this one because they also have the distribution of resources around the world. And if you have to ship your solar panels, for example, at the end of the life, ship back all the way back to China, for example, to my company, then that's not the way how it will work. Now, how it works is, I think the law is going to be in place is that when you sell a solar panel, you put, correct me if I'm wrong, Renate, is you add a little bit of the fee to the price of the solar panel at the end, then that money is going to be funded for the management of the waste.
Australia is developing regulations around that, and that is one of the plans. That is definitely happening in Europe, and it has been happening so there's one US-based company with a strong reputation in solar, and they add it to their price of the solar, the cost of recycling. The industry, being a green energy industry, is mindful of its lifetime issues.
I was going to say, is that a thing that is front and centre? Because you don't want to be accused of not being environmentally friendly at any point of the supply chain.
No, we're held to a much higher bar than any other industry.
Does it frustrate you sometimes that people will pick on slight little things of, oh, well, it costs that much to transport? Or
actually not at all, because everything is calculated very sophisticated. We call it part of the ESG, I guess. Actually, a lot of, in my company, some big projects, when they set up the sort of criteria for selection of panels, they have very, very strong incentives in terms of green manufacturing, green production. We have to tick all the boxes. So I don't think it's an issue. And we try all our ways to make it greener and greener.
My point was more that critics will always jump on something. And does that frustrate you that every slight little thing is criticised?
So it doesn't. I'm perfectly happy to be held to account. So there's a whole lot of innovation, chemistry and material science going on around taking the panels apart, but also looking at how, when we build them in the first place, if we can build them both to last 40 years, but to be easier to take apart when we're ready to take them apart. So we're absolutely owning the challenge and no problem being held to account because we want to be able to justify this pathway.
No problems at all. I'm very happy to take that challenge. We are taking the challenge throughout the way. For example, when we have to make a choice between the stainless steel frame and the aluminum frame, and we have to think about the carbon emission and the weight, that's one box to tick. We have to choose one material or the other. When we have to choose HJT or TOPCon, one is a low temperature process, one is a high temperature process, then we have to think, well, if it is possible, we would like to use low temperature process. So when we build the solar panels, we check the bloom of a material, the process, the temperature, the emission, and the fluoride-based backsheet, for example. We have to think about it very carefully because that could be a toxic material. So when we build it, we think it very through.
All of these things sound very exciting, and my impression is that the young generation have this front and centre in their mind more and more. Just to finish off, I wondered if I could ask you, if you were a 16 or 17-year-old today thinking of going into a career related to solar energy, what would you be most excited about?
The opportunity to change the world, to really have to do something where you really make a difference, to use your powers for good. And to be sure that there's a job in it. They're not all engineering jobs. We need the lawyers, we need the bankers, we need the communicators, and the teachers, all on side.
Ouyang, what would you be most excited about if you could be that 16 or 17-year-old?
Almost the same to Renate, but probably faced in a different ways. Like if I have to make a choice, like for example, graduate from high school and which major to take, I would think in a pool, I have the things I want to do, and I have to forecast the future of the career. And then we have the significance and meaningfulness of the job. Then if you combine together renewable and solar, that's the way to go.
This has been a really illuminating discussion, I think, for everyone. Professor Renate Egan, many thanks for making the time to join us.
A great pleasure.
And thanks also to Dr. Ouyang. It's been great to speak with you.
The same to you.
Unfortunately, that's all we've got time for today. Thank you for listening. I've been Neil Martin, and I hope you'll join me again soon for the next episode in our Engineering the Future series.
You've been listening to the UNSW Engineering the Future podcast. Don't forget to subscribe to our series to stay updated on upcoming episodes. Check out our show notes for details on in-person events, panel discussions, and more fascinating insights into the future of engineering.